The next segment of the turning of the wheel is going to be about Aquarius. And the first part is about the sign of Aquarius. If you were born in February and you've been told you were an Aquarian, or maybe you know your moon is in Aquarius. The second part is about the age of Aquarius and what that means, the New World Age. Now, we have a lot of PowerPoint slides, and I want you just to breathe and don't get overwhelmed, because these really are quite understandable, and they are just the best explanations of these things that I have ever been able to find. So we start with this. You recognize this? This is our solar system. And it has the sun in the middle. It shows how almost all the planets are in the same plane. And that plane is called the ecliptic. There's not a whole lot of strange words you have to learn today, but we will be using that word ecliptic. Pluto, if you still consider it a planet, is the exception. It doesn't go in the same kind of orbits as the others. And in this particular slide, this thing that is going in a different direction is a comet. So you can ignore that. And we just have the planets in their orbits going outward from the sun, and the asteroid belt here, and this particular diagram goes clear out to Neptune and does not have Pluto. And the reason that this is important is that you get the idea of the ecliptic, that the Earth and the other planets and the sun are all in their orbits like a phonograph record, going around in different tracks of the record at different speeds and in different locations, but in the same plane. The next slide illustrates the constellations, and that's the same thing as saying the signs of the zodiac, as they are in a ring around the ecliptic. So here we just have the sun and the earth. We don't have the other planets. And the orbit of the earth is in the ecliptic, and this ring of constellations is in the sky in that same plane. Now, the astrologers took some liberties. For instance, some constellations are a lot smaller. Look how small Aries is. And some of them are kind of sprawly. Look at Pisces. But for the sake of astrology, they have divided them all into the same size. And it's 30 degrees. So 12 signs by 30 degrees is 360 degrees, which is the circle. Now, let's say that somebody told you you were a Leo. And you went through life saying, I'm Leo, I'm like the lion, I've got a wonderful personality, I'm magnanimous, I'm a good showman. But if that's all you knew, you really didn't know why you were told you were a Leo. And normally the reason would have been that when you were born, here's the earth, and as the earth looked toward the sun appeared to be in front of the constellation of Leo. Astrology is geocentric, and that means the earth is the center of everything. So as you look from the earth toward the sun, behind the sun, you would see the constellation Leo, and you would say, oh, the sun is in the sign of Leo. If you were born that day, you are a Leo. And then as the earth travels on its orbit, The next place is going to stop, and it doesn't stop, but it would look at the sun. Actually, it goes this way. And it would see the constellation Virgo behind the sun. And as the Earth continued on its orbit and looked at the sun, it would appear that the sun was progressing through the signs of the zodiac, Libra, and then Scorpio and Sagittarius. And depending on when you were born, you would have been told, you're a Scorpio, you're a Sagittarius. And what that really meant was that the sun was in that sign when you were born. Okay. Now, you remember our first picture when we showed the solar system and all the different planets. This is like a combination of the first two slides we looked at. It shows the ecliptic, the sun, the earth, and a bunch of other planets. And it also has the constellations in a ring around the ecliptic. It's using the astrological glyphs for it. And it shows how, since the earth is the center of everything in astrology, geocentric, that from the earth, it will look like planets are in front of different constellations or in different signs. If we look at this particular diagram, on this dotted line, that would be Jupiter. And it would look like Jupiter was just leaving Gemini, headed toward Cancer. And then we would see the Earth looking across the sun to this one, which is Aries, if I've got that right. And that would be where the sun was. So we could assume this was an April position. And here's little Mercury. And it would have been considered to have been leaving this sign. And then we have Mars, which is in this sign, which I think is Pisces, and Jupiter. And then finally down here, Venus. So when you know that you're a Leo, and it means that your sun is in Leo, that is only one little piece of information if you're going to understand astrology. Because all the other planets, other than Earth and the Moon, are all in signs according to when you were born and the positions of these planets, these heavenly bodies in their orbits in the ecliptic. And all of those together create a natal chart, a natal horoscope, and they all mean something. So if we were going to talk about Jupiter and Saturn being in Aquarius, in this particular diagram, this glyph right here is Aquarius. You can't see it real well, but that's okay. And that would have meant on December the 21st, Saturn in its orbit would be right here, and Jupiter in its orbit would be in the same place. And that tells us why they were both in Aquarius on the winter solstice. This next slide shows us just, an example of a bunch of planets all lined up. Now you know that when Saturn and Jupiter were conjunct, they really weren't touching each other. Saturn was behind Jupiter because Jupiter is closer to the Earth. So from the Earth, you would see Jupiter, and Saturn was passing in its orbit behind where Jupiter was in its orbit. They were millions and millions of miles apart. But that is what a conjunction is. And the reason that I bring this up right now is that one of the remarkable things that is going to happen in February is that there will be 6 planets, if you count the moon as a planet and the sun, all in Aquarius at the same time. And they will be the sun, the moon, Mercury, Jupiter, and Saturn, and Venus. The moon changes signs every 2.5 days. You know, it goes through all of them. It goes through each month. It goes through all of them. It gets 2.5 days in each. So you won't have all 6 all month. But on February 10th and 11th, the moon and these other 5 heavenly bodies will all be in Aquarius. And each one will stay in Aquarius according to its own orbit. They have entered the sign of Aquarius at different times, and they have different speeds, and it takes them different lengths of time to pass through a sign or to make a complete orbit around the sun. So this part of our presentation has been an explanation of the sign of Aquarius and what it means when somebody says, "Oh, you're a Pisces." It means that's where the sun was when you were born, and how astrology is geocentric, and how from the earth you look at the other heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, the other planets, and see where the constellation looks like it's behind that planet, and that is the sign they are in. And now we're going to change gears. Now we're going to change to the Age of Aquarius. This is the Earth. And most of you probably know that the Earth is not straight up and down as it rotates on its axis. It's at a tilt. It's at a tilt of 23.5 degrees. And that changes everything. In most of the diagrams of the Earth, you'll see this one's got little dotted lines coming down from the South Pole and up from the North Pole. And you will see lines like poles coming out of the poles, which help you stay oriented in the way that the Earth is tilting and its orbit around the sun. The tilt of the Earth is the reason we have seasons. It is the reason that we have equinoxes and solstices. It's the reason we have different climate zones. And in this next diagram, we see the Earth as it's moving around the sun. It moves in a counterclockwise direction. And when we talk during today's presentation about the seasons, and we will always be referring to the northern hemisphere where we live. Know that they are opposite in the southern hemisphere. But right here is the winter solstice, December the 21st. And you'll see that in the winter, the Earth was pointed kind of toward the right and to the back, away from the sun. And then it traveled around to March for the spring equinox. And for the 2 equinoxes, spring and autumn, the Earth's relationship to the sun is with the sun shining directly at the equator, causing equal length days and nights. And for the solstices, it's quite the opposite, and that's when you have your shortest day of the year for the winter and your longest day of the year for the summer. And notice here, and we're going to come back to this slide. There's a couple other slides I want to show you, but then we'll be back to this one. Notice the poles coming out of the poles, indicating the tilt of the Earth. This slide illustrates basically the same thing, But there are two things about it that I really, really like. First of all, it's got the shadows on it. It's easier to see where the sun is hitting the planet. But furthermore, right up here on each one of these poles coming out of the North Poles is another little circle. And if you could see it, it's got an arrow on it, and it goes the opposite direction of the sun, the Earth's orbit around the sun. And that is called the wobble. It's just like if you had a top and you spun a top and you looked at it. After a while, that top isn't going like this, it's going like this. Notice that regardless of where the Earth is in its orbit, those poles are slanted the same way. You see that? As it travels around, even though the Earth is rotating and it's revolving around the sun, it's maintaining that tilt. Only it's really not, because of the wobble. And if we were to look at this diagram in 13,000 years from now, all of those tilts would be the opposite direction. Because that's what the wobble does. It does it very slowly. About 26,000 years it takes to make that little circle at the top, which causes the tilt of the Earth to point in different directions. So if we went through the 26,000 year cycle, we could start here. In about 6,500 years, it would look like it was pointed away from the sun. 13,000, it would be in the opposite direction. And then halfway back to home, it would be pointed toward the sun. And in 26,000, more or less, years, it would be back where it started. But this has an impact. It has an impact on on more than one thing. It has an impact on where the North Star is. This is the Earth with the pole indicated, pointing toward Polaris, which is the current North Star. In 13,000 years, the North Star is going to be Vega. It's been Vega before. Because of the wobble, the North Pole points to different places in its own little circle, going the opposite direction of the orbit of the Earth. So the North Star is one of the main impacts that has. This is why the North Star is not a consistent star, although in your lifetime it will be. And then back to this diagram. Every year, the exact time and date of the equinoxes and the solstices changes a little bit. The winter solstice, which was December the 21st this year, occurred at 2:02 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And you can bet your booty that astrologers and astronomers know exactly when these things occur, down to the seconds, down to the nanoseconds. But because of the wobble, it isn't the same. It creeps backward. And that is called the precession of the equinoxes. I have studied the precession of the equinoxes for over 20 years. And I think I understand about 80 or 90% of it now. And some of that just happened this last week. Now, you know that the word procession means moving forward. And the word precession means moving backward. So the impact of the wobble, especially since it goes in the opposite direction from the sun's orbit, the Earth's orbit around the sun, is that every year. The winter solstice, the spring equinox, the summer solstice, the autumn equinox happen a little bit sooner, precession, but going back. The spring equinox is the one that astrologers use for most of their examples. And it currently happens around March the 20th. If you could go 2,000 or so years ago, it would be in April. And if you could go 2,000 or so years from now, it would be in February, because it moves backward according to our calendar. And that is the precession of the equinoxes. The spring and autumn equinoxes precede, move backward with time. And this is that the tilt of the earth changes relative to the sun. The astrological age, the age of Aquarius that we keep talking about, is determined by the sign the sun is in at the spring equinox. So, why is it so difficult to pinpoint when the age of Aquarius actually begins? I, in my research, have seen that it began on 2012, and a paragraph later that it wouldn't begin until after 2500. Part of the reason is the inaccuracy of our calendars. You know, we have superimposed a man-made mathematical fictitious time measuring system over a natural system. You'd think that you could just ask, when was the spring equinox, the year Jesus was born? Or, you might just estimate that as 2,000 years ago. But we currently use the Gregorian calendar, and it was not developed until 1582 AD or CE. So first of all, the calendar we use did not exist when Jesus was born. You got a bunch of translating to do even there. And in a very pesky way, the orbit and the revolution of our planet refuses to conform with our calendar. And there are always these leftover fractions of time that need to be accounted for. That's why we have leap year. And all together, it is a very confusing, a very frustrating thing to study, and yet I have never found anything more fascinating. So 20 years into it, I've made some progress. I don't think I have all the answers, but I'm a lot closer than I used to be. So we go back to the turning of the wheel and we ask, why all the hubbub about the age of Aquarius? Why did they sing about the dawning of the age of Aquarius using words like harmony and understanding, no more falsehoods or derisions? I wanted to share with you some of the characteristics that are associated with the sign of Aquarius and therefore the age of Aquarius. And they include dramatic breakthroughs and quantum leaps, rebirth and awakening, surprising resolution of problems, unexpected openings and opportunities, expanded horizons, incurable and infectious optimism, transcendence of petty problems and attachments, feelings of universal redemption, higher emancipation, the truth that sets you free, and the ascendancy of the liberal, humanitarian, and progressive impulses. So this is the end of our presentation on the Age of Aquarius, but I wanted to give you just a way to anchor yourself in something a little bit more familiar before we actually close this section. And that is to remind you that you are here. This is the Milky Way galaxy. It is a spiral galaxy. And we are in the remote outpost of it. And when you look up into the sky and see the Milky Way, what you are really looking at is one of the arms of the spiral galaxy. You can't tell it from this perspective, but that's what you're looking at, is one of the arms of the spiral galaxy. And so thus ends the presentation on all things Aquarius.